What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show.
But again, part of the reason they felt they could get away with it is the place was so isolated. It was very hard to travel to and see it. And very few journalists, if any, actually went there. And I think they counted on that in their analysis. You know, they're like, well, this is kind of a very isolated area. We could probably get away with this here. Or even as they litigated, like, people are not going to pay that much attention to this. There might be an article here or there. I'd say the press coverage really started to kick into gear when we got them into trial in the early 2000s. Be like, wow, there's a trial. And I remember the very first day of the trial in October of 2003.
In Ecuador.
In Ecuador, in that little town of Lago Agrio, Cofán territory. Town that did not have a paved road or a stoplight. Okay. There were journalists there from, at the time, were the Big Four, which was the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and LA Times. People might not remember, but like those were the Big Four newspapers in the U.S.
Yeah.
And they still are to some degree, although the LA Times is like, a shadow of its former self and, whatever. But there was a lot of media coverage at the beginning of the trial in the Ecuador phase, which is what I would call phase 2, which lasted from 2003 to 2011 when we won the case in the trial court. It took 9 years. Yeah. Because they did the same BS in Ecuador, the Ecuador trial that they did in the first phase, the 10-year phase in the U.S., which is they tried to drag it out as much as they could. They, requested all these field inspections that were just redundant. They filed literally dozens of motions, in an hour just to tie up the judge. In Ecuador's courts don't have the resources of U.S. courts. Like they move a little more slowly. And they took advantage of that because, the main advantage they had over us was resource. They had money. And they were willing to spend it. And they knew we had very little. So, they would, and this has always been their strategy until it's not that relevant at this point because we won. But for years, their strategy was to, use their money to pay a bunch of lawyers to sort of throw, sand into the gears of the justice system so it would go on for as long as possible because they would rather pay lawyers to just litigate than have a final decision that would likely go against them. And that was their strategy.
Now, this being an Ecuadorian court, though, obviously you're involved with the case. The counter attorneys from the U.S. are involved with the case, but you guys, I would assume, have to have like lead Ecuadorian counsel down there, right?
Yeah.
So how would you describe, like from a layman's standpoint, how would you describe that role? Are you making the case behind the scenes and then they're putting it in court and arguing it, or is it a collaboration? How did it work?
I would say it was a true collaboration. I mean, basically, they know their system. And by the way, Ecuador has a different legal system than the U.S. system in many respects. It's what's called a civil law system, and we have a common law system. So people, little quick law lesson, if I
Please.
may. We come out of the British tradition, which is like the Commonwealth tradition, the Great Britain, Australia, Canada, the United States, basically the places Britain colonized. And then a lot of the rest of the world has a civil system which has its origin in the Spanish legal system. And the places Spain colonized, Latin America, Louisiana, actually in the United States, the French also were into this, have a totally different kind of system that's more judge-centered versus, I would say lawyer-centered, which is ours. In a civil system, the judge has an enormous amount of power. There's generally not a jury. In the common law system, the lawyers have a ton of power, and there's usually a jury, judges always have a certain amount of power, but they're very different systems designed for the same purpose, which is to sort of adjudicate conflicts fairly,
Right.
Find the facts, find the truth. But we were not qualified as American lawyers, and we're not allowed to practice law in Ecuador. So we were able to take our expertise about science, about expert reports, about how to battle this out in the media. And also we could look at Ecuador's laws and sort of, work with our local lawyers on strategy. But, one of the satisfying things about the experience is the Ecuadorian lawyers who worked on our case, mostly Pablo Fajardo, Juan Pablo Sanchez, and Julio Prieto did a great job really pushing this. in a way that over time they really led this. And they did a great job. I mean, we financed it. We were able to get experts on science and oil, contamination from the United States to help. But they were really the lead lawyers during the case in Ecuador.
Is that hard with the expert side of things? This is always something that's interesting to me because, like, you can go to websites of guys who make a living off of being a legal expert on something that they're an expert on, and then you'll see the cases they work. And it'll be, and I think in some ways this is good, by the way, but it'll be cases on a certain type of issue where they take the opposite side depending on who hires them, right? So not the same cases, but maybe the same family of types of cases. And so what I always wonder is there a piece of, like, are you competing with some capitalism here on both sides where it's like, okay, well, you hire this expert, you're paying them, they're happy to be paid, they want to help you out, they're hiring that expert, they're paying them, they're probably even more happy to be paid, but a lot more, and they're helping them out, and then that kind of, you have trouble getting to the actual truth of that?
Well, it's a good question. In U.S. courts, and there's an issue that experts need to opine on for a jury or a judge, both sides hire their own expert. They pay them, and they produce usually opposite conclusions,
right.
And the jury has to assess them as witnesses, like who has more credibility, who seems to be doing a better job, who's right, who's wrong, that kind of stuff. So it's a battle where both sides control their own experts. In a civil law system like the one in Ecuador, often the judge will appoint the expert.
Oh.
And there's only one expert. But that has its own set of problems for various reasons because, it's not, adversarial as much, and you don't really get 2 points of view. In our case in Ecuador, the judge actually adopted the U.S. system, and both Chevron and our side used our own experts on all these site visits. So the judge had the benefit of two separate expert views of stuff under the control of the parties. But, yeah, I mean, if a party hires an expert and pays him or her, they expect the report to come out a certain way, and you could argue, well, that's not science, that's not truth, that's not objective. But the reality is juries are not dumb. Like, they can look at these reports and look at the testimony and assess it for themselves, and they often come to, I think, really good conclusions.
Okay. So you guys are pulling all these experts during this 8-year trial. I don't even know how it lasts that long. But that's crazy. Years. Did you also get to bring in witnesses, like some of the people? Yeah,
so the way it worked, the reason it lasted 8 years is because in Ecuador, the civil law system, you don't see this in the U.S., a lot of the trial consisted of the parties going to these polluted sites, these well sites with all these pits, and taking water and soil samples in front of the judge and taking witness testimony from people who lived around the pits. And each of these are called inspections. Site inspections, and we would do, the weeks we would do this, it was like once a month we'd go out for 2 days. And Chevron sort of saw this as an opportunity to delay and sabotage the trial. They basically asked for dozens and dozens of these inspections, and they're expensive to do. You have to pay people to go, and you pay for lab tests and stuff. And over time, every inspection showed the same thing, like massive pollution, like incredibly high rates of total petroleum hydrocarbons and other harmful chemicals, in these sites that were clearly cancer-causing. So after a certain time, we asked the judge, we don't need to keep doing this. Every single one of these sites shows the same results. Texaco, now Chevron, caused a massive environmental disaster that's harming the environment and putting out substances that kill people if they're ingested. We don't need to continue the trial because they were using these inspections to keep delaying the final result, the final resolution.
Was their side trying to find stuff different and saying, look, it's not that bad?
They were using junk science, yes. I mean, I noticed this constantly. For example, if there's a pit in a certain location, we would go sample in the pit or right next to the pit to show the pollution. They would look at the pit and they would walk up a little hill, like 200 yards, and take a sample up there to, quote unquote, prove that the pollution hadn't spread. Oh, this is clean. It's no big deal. The pit isn't harming anyone. It hasn't really spread. I mean,
it's in the water, though.
Yeah, no, it is in the water, but they're not sampling where they think they're going to find it. I mean, they would send their teams out the day before, the week before these planned inspections, and they would sample the site secretly to figure out when the judge shows up where they could sample that would in places that would not produce results. They would sample secretly, like get these really bad results. We know this because we ended up getting this information of their secret sampling. And then when the judge would come, they would commit, in my opinion, fraud. They would basically go sample in places where they knew there was not contamination as a way to try to deceive the court into thinking they hadn't caused any harm. I mean,
my God.
This is the kind of crap we had to deal with constantly. You know, this effort to sabotage the trial, or to the extent they had to report sampling results, they tried to report deceptive sampling results.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.